Did U.S. airstrikes indiscriminately kill civilians in Raqqa? A human rights report says the Pentagon is probably guilty of war crimes. I'm Aditya Nayanar, and today's newsmaker is Syria's civilian deaths. The fall of Daesh last year in the city it claimed as its capital was celebrated by coalition forces as a major victory in the Syrian war. But according to Amnesty International, civilians living in Raqqa were faced with an awful choice. Either run from the violence and risk being killed by Daesh, or stay in their homes and be killed by the U.S.-led coalition. Amnesty argues the U.S. military used disproportionate and indiscriminate force, and that their claims of precision airstrikes do not stand up to scrutiny. But a military spokesman says Amnesty's claims lack proper vetting, and he criticized researchers for not sharing their findings before publishing them. So, can Amnesty International's accusations be backed up? Here's Haider Abbasi.
The landscape of Raqqa is unchanging. In every direction, this is all you see. A city destroyed. But who's to blame for this devastation? It's not just the regime of Syria's Bashar al-Assad, but also the United States and its allies. Amnesty International says US-led airstrikes on the city killed hundreds of civilians and destroyed countless homes.
We're talking about airstrikes, which should be fairly precise. So if buildings after buildings were destroyed with entire families inside, something must have gone wrong, and that something must be investigated.
The US-led coalition began bombing Raqqa last year in a campaign to remove Daesh from the city. Raqqa had been captured by the terror group in 2014, but Amnesty says the aerial bombardment was disproportionate and indiscriminate. The human rights group says the US was responsible for 90% of all airstrikes during the 4 months of the operation. It says the coalition fired 30,000 rounds of artillery into the city.
That's tantamount to indiscriminate strikes, because each artillery rounds will have a margin of error of about 100 meters. In a city where 10 meters can make the difference between a house full of civilians and the HQ of ISIS.
Amnesty says it interviewed 112 people during its visit to the city, including relatives of the Badran family. Everyone seen here was killed in a coalition airstrike, according to the human rights group. It alleges 39 members of the family died in the attack. It seems civilians in Raqqa had an impossible choice: leave and risk being killed by Daesh, or stay and risk being hit by the airstrikes. The coalition rejects Amnesty's findings and says it took great care to minimize the danger to civilians.
I would put the blame on ISIS for destroying the city of Raqqa. We liberated the city of Raqqa. The city deserves better, and we're going to try to provide that.
1 year later, and Amnesty says the coalition hasn't investigated a single case of civilians dying from its airstrikes. Did the US and its allies violate humanitarian law during the air campaign in Raqqa? And can they be held responsible? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our panel. In Beirut is Benjamin Walsby, who co-authored Amnesty International's report on Raqqa. Here in the studio is retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, who was the U.S. military's spokesman in Iraq. And also with me in the studio is Ammar Khaf, an executive director at the Omran Center for Strategic Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you for joining us here on The Newsmakers. General Kimmitt, let's start with you. You are a person that has previous experience in assessing civilian casualties. It's been 8 months since the coalition defeated Daesh in Raqqa, liberating its, the city and recapturing it from its de facto capital. And this report by Amnesty International says that the incidents, namely the deaths of hundreds of innocent civilians as a result of the coalition airstrikes, has not been investigated by the U.S. It's been 8 months. Why hasn't the U.S. Attempted to start an investigation?
Well, that's just categorically not correct. If you go onto the website of the coalition, it will show you that those incidents being investigated and it's being fully transparent. So I believe that short of on-the-ground investigations, which for obvious reasons can't be done in Raqqa right now, that the coalition is doing exactly what it should.
Benjamin Walsby, before publishing this report, did you approach the Pentagon for a comment or an interview or to get the latest stats into this report?
We did, yeah. We wrote to the three countries that carried out the bombing, so the US, the UK and France. The US requested more time. We felt we'd given them quite enough time, considering we gave them the coordinates of the incidents that we wanted them to look into. They should have this information, but they wanted more time, so we went ahead and published anyway. But if I could address the point that the Brigadier General made about the on-site investigations, I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't do this. I don't see any obvious reasons why that can't happen. We went and we did it. Their partner forces, the SDF, are in full control of the city, so therefore there's no reason why a team of US investigators wouldn't be able to go to the city and investigate on the ground, because when you go to the ground, you realise it's a very different thing from watching the video feeds, which is how they do their investigations. I mean, so far the coalition admits to having killed 23 civilians in Raqqa. In one of our cases, they killed more members of a family than that. I mean, they're so wide of the mark, and it's because they're not investigating properly. And you can go onto their website and you can see that most of the reports of civilian casualties are just listed as non-credible, and then they're not investigated.
General?
Well, first of all, let's put this in perspective. I start off at a very back-footed position because let's acknowledge war is not a good thing. Nobody wants to resort to it. But I find it interesting that the number 23 was brought up. And every one of those casualties is a tragedy. But Great Britain used to kill upwards of 20,000 to 30,000 civilians in a single bomb strike in World War II at Hamburg and at Dresden. And I think, again, 23 is too large of a number. 0 is the right number. But I think those numbers demonstrate the incredible pains that we go to avoid civilian casualties. Nothing is mentioned about the number of targets that were waved off because of the danger of civilian casualties. I did this for a living inside the United States military. I just left Baghdad this morning. I know what incredible pains they went to avoid these civilian casualties.
But there is a difference, you must admit, in terms of the technology between World War I and right now. For the last 15 years, the U.S. Army has been saying that we're using precision munitions, smart bombs, and this is something that you've defended for the better part of more than a decade. But when you look at the numbers that Amnesty report is actually putting forth, would it be a little bit too presumptuous to actually say that maybe it's not as precise as the bombs may be called?
Well, let's be very clear. Anytime you kill a civilian, that's one too many. But again, when you go from Bomber Harris, one of the great heroes of the British military, killing 20,000 civilians in one day, versus the fact that over a period of time, we have been able to reduce that to an infinitesimal decimal of that number, I think it goes to show the tremendous pains. We'll never be happy until the number is 0, but that's not reality. The reality of war is when you have an enemy that wraps themselves around civilians intentionally to use them as human shields, the vast majority of the times we don't attack because we know that there are some times when the estimates are wrong and tragedies like the 23 members of that family are killed.
We'll continue with the reality of war, but I want to bring in Omar Kaf. When you look at how this operation was planned, was it a well-planned operation?
Well, I don't see indicators of a well-planned operation, to be honest. I see an operation that relied heavily on intel based on a group that is very controversial on the ground, a group that has missed and gave coordinates of a school, for example, to the U.S. Army that shelled it in the west of Raqqa. So I believe that it could have been done much better with much more coordination with actors on the ground. There were way too many strikes. Every square kilometers of Raqqa received at least 800 strikes on average per month for the 5-month period. And so it was very heavily shelled without a plan to save or to send or to safeguard the civilians. And at the end, there was a plan to give an exit pathway for the leftover ISIS fighters to exit the city safely. So I think there was, obviously there were many plans being put, but I think the plan was not good enough. And the precision bombers that the US used in other places were much more precise in targeting specific targets, meaning specifically targeting leadership. I did not see the indicators on the ground that relied, and the level of destruction is huge. After 8 months now of the operation, we still, not more than 50%, from my figures at least on the ground, have returned to those cities. Their cities are still not safe to return. The mines have not been swept. Huge civilian and infrastructure damages. And still the governing council of Raqqa is still a very controversial one. And this has actually led to the incitement of pro-Iran and pro-regime forces to call for the resistance movement in Raqqa to target again American soldiers. And so this, I think it's counterproductive, and it has already led now to the Baqir groups in Raqqa trying to capitalize on these numbers of casualties and say, hey, listen, the Americans did not do a good job and we should fight back. And that's very unfortunate. That's something that was not accounted for. That's when you focus on fighting ISIS and ignoring the context and ignoring the partners that are being used on the ground that could backfire on everybody, to be honest.
General Kimit, Ammar said this was not a well-planned operation. The intelligence gathering process was flawed at times. Let me add another ring into this. The Defense Secretary, James Mattis, said before this operation that this was going to be a war of annihilation. When all this is said, doesn't it give the impression that in war all is fair? And I want you to compare that to what you said, even one civilian death is too many for you.
Well, let me unpack a couple of the comments you made. If, in fact, Raqqa was singled out for particular destruction, as was suggested, I would recommend my colleague go up to Mosul and see the amount of damage that was done in Mosul. What I would also expect somebody to acknowledge is right now we have hundreds of demining operations going on in Fallujah and in Mosul, and eventually they will have to get to Raqqa as well. As to the planning, again, when I was a commander, I used to direct strikes. When I was a planner, I used to conduct planning. I can tell you, I spend a lot of time near the forces inside of Baghdad. They have been planning the liberation of Raqqa for years, if not, certainly large numbers of months, if not years. And to suggest that it was not properly planned, I think, is a comment that it comes from no factual basis. We spent hours and hours and hours, days and weeks planning the attack on Raqqa, and I think it's important to recognize that Raqqa is no longer the caliphate for the Islamic State, which has been such a brutal force throughout the world.
Benjamin, the general has said right now that they go through a very rigorous process. The U.S.-led coalition has stated on many instances that they apply those rigorous standards when they are planning an operation like this or the targeting process, and they take extraordinary efforts to protect non-combatants. Is this what you saw?
I'm afraid the gap between the narrative coming from the coalition and the reality on the ground in Raqqa is staggering. If the Brigadier General went to Raqqa, as we did, I also worked in Mosul, I also co-authored our report on Mosul, but if he went, or if his investigators, US military investigators, coalition investigators went to the ground in Raqqa, they would learn something about the brutal realities of war, something they like to talk about as if they have a monopoly on understanding that, when they don't actually go. We should also be a bit more honest about the numbers, frankly. The coalition has admitted to 23 civilian deaths. I see no point in making comparisons with whatever the British Army did in the Second World War. That was awful. I'm not going to defend that for a second. But hopefully, as people, we advance and we move on. There's also a very different legal framework in place now than there was at that time too. But 23 are not the right numbers. I mean, we had 39 from one family. In four cases, just 4 cases we focused on. The coalition's responsible for killing 70. That's 4 cases. There's strikes on every street in Raqqa. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to work out the numbers. And we're being conservative, frankly, when we put in the report hundreds of civilians, because it's more likely to be thousands. In terms of the planning, yes, they did have time. Of course they have time, and they took time. And they should have known, because ISIS was the same enemy. They were using the same tactics in Mosul that they used in Raqqa. But here's a question for the Brigadier General. What about the size of the bombs? There's two problems essentially with the targeting. If you don't know what you're shooting at, you're going to shoot at the wrong thing. Video drones will not show you the families cowering in the back rooms and the basements. And yes, they hide there for a long time. So watching it for an hour and a half is probably not going to be long enough to establish their patterns of life, but that's something the coalition could and should have known. Secondly, why use such big bombs? I mean, you've got smaller munitions available which can hit precise targets. There's no point in precision targeting. If the bomb you drop is so big, it's going to kill your target, but it's going to kill everybody else around them as well. And time after time, we've witnessed buildings that, suffered airstrikes and being destroyed completely. That means the bombs they were using were too big.
General, was it poor surveillance, and why so big bombs?
Well, first of all, let's be very clear. That was not the only intelligence that we're using. Video surveillance, we're using signals intelligence, we're using human intelligence, we're using other types of intelligence. Obviously, we can't discuss that here. Anybody who goes to a battlefield after a battle certainly understands the tragedy that happened there. Somebody who's actually been in the battle and has seen the horrific aspects of what ISIS does to individual civilians. Would we have had a better solution? If we did, we would have used it. Everybody criticizes how we did it. Everybody criticizes the fact that we did not keep the civilian casualties down to zero. Yet I hear no constructive solutions about how it would have been done better by those civilians sitting on the sidelines as we're putting our troops into the breach.
But what do you say to the mother of that family, what was written in Benjamin and in the Amnesty International report, where they said that the planes had circled and asked if the U.S. planes, if they couldn't identify them as civilians?
Well, again, these are all allegations. And to suggest that the United States and its coalition partners don't do investigations, the fact that they are not complete yet doesn't mean that they are not ever going to be investigated. We saw time and time again allegations of bombings, allegations of targets being hit that proved not to be true. But look, I appreciate everything that Amnesty International is trying to do. I appreciate the fact that they help us understand the tragedy, that this is not some video game, that this actually has consequences on the ground. We would prefer to have a better way. Amnesty International has not suggested a better way. My colleague has not suggested a better way. I don't like putting American soldiers and talking to their mothers about why their sons and daughters died as well. And to suggest that I don't understand war, coming from an academic, I think is, well, I won't get into the ad hominem discussions here.
Benjamin, the general said that he'd like to see a better way. What could that way be?
Well, first, I appreciate the General's comments about Amnesty. He does seem to accept that we have a role to play in this, and that's constructive, that's good. A better way, well, investigating properly would be a good start, a very good start. Another thing that we're suggesting is that the coalition releases information, more information about its strikes, because if it's true that they abided by international humanitarian law, the laws of war, 100% in every single strike, they would have nothing to fear by releasing, not at the time, nobody's asking for a running commentary, that's silly. But afterwards, and even some weeks afterwards, within a reasonable time frame, they could tell us a bit more about the locations of strikes, the explosive weights used, and the targets, and yet they don't. They report on their strikes and they say near Raqqa. Why the deliberate vagueness? Well, I mean, if they abided by the law all the time, then what have they got to hide? So these are things that they could do to improve things. They could release the information, which would allow us to have a better idea about, because we don't say that they violated international law because we don't have enough information. Only they can provide that information. What we say is that there's a strong prima facie case to answer, which there is. But it's having access to that kind of information that would allow people to be more definite about legalities and issues concerned. And I think everybody agrees that that is important. So yeah, more transparency and serious investigations with on-site visits. The Brigadier General didn't answer my question about why US forces couldn't go to Raqqa when their partner forces are in complete control of the city, because they could.
Well, again, what I've heard is a constructive narrative on how to investigate incidents. What I have not heard is a constructive narrative on how we can avoid this in the first place. If we don't use precision weapons and we don't use these types of military strikes, are we going to drop unicorns and baby dolls against ISIS and expect them to give up? That's ludicrous. War is always the
That is
last
ludicrous.
resort. War is always the last resort. We
Yeah.
prefer not to do it, but sometimes you have to put your young men and women into the breach to stop evil like ISIS.
Amar, you've heard Benjamin,
Sure.
and
The
you've actually
reason-
heard the General speak, but when you look at this report and the discussion that's been going on, do you feel that, does this reflect a different reality here, what's being sort of said in Raqqa?
I mean, the people's lives were destroyed by ISIS first, and first actually by the Assad regime that has also tortured the people of Raqqa, and then by ISIS. And no one is contesting that ISIS has committed humongous crimes against the people, and this was the headquarters of ISIS, and it was important to perhaps annihilate ISIS headquarters. But what's being questioned is the precision levels of the weapons that have been used. I believe that the precision was not a very high precision weaponry, because the results look like it was not high precision, and that there could have been better ones. Now, the life on the ground today has been very controversial. Again, the Raqqa local council has been a very controversial one, causing a lot of backlash.
General Mark Kimitz, Amar Kaf, and Benjamin Wolseley from Beirut, thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers.
Sure.
Coming up on the program, is the Pakistani military trying to silence journalists ahead of the elections? And will this UNESCO World Heritage Site in Kenya be destroyed by a coal-fueled power plant? Pakistan has been considered one of the most dangerous countries for journalists to work in. Military rule, religious extremism, and traditional warfare have long put reporters' lives in danger. But now they say they're facing a new threat, and it's coming from their own military. For the first time, the army is outing specific journalists as being against the state, and they're tending to target reporters who are active on social media, which is seen by many as a way to get around censorship taking place on television. So, is Pakistan's military treating dissent as a crime? Here's Christine Pirovarakis.
In Pakistan, journalists, activists, and bloggers critical of the military have had to pay a price. Many are kidnapped, beaten, or even killed. Newspaper columnist Gul Bukhari, who criticized the military for interfering in politics, was abducted while on her way to a TV studio in Lahore earlier this month. It happened a day after the military warned critics it was monitoring social media for anti-state, anti-Pakistan, and anti-army material. Pakistan's military has often interfered with the civilian running of the government. Former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has accused the army of orchestrating his removal last year. He was found guilty of corruption and later barred from politics for life. Journalists and activists say censorship is on the rise by the military in the run-up to the parliamentary election next month. The army has denied the charges. But threats to journalists and activists don't end with the military. While the military is alleged to be the primary culprit, political and religious groups have also been responsible for harassment and assaults against journalists. Investigative journalist Asad Koral was physically assaulted and hospitalized, allegedly on the orders of a major political party, in relation to what's known as the Model Town incident. Militants on both sides of the fighting in the province of Baluchistan are also responsible for some of the most serious of attacks. Pakistan is among the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. Reporters Without Borders say it ranks 139 out of 180 countries. The Committee to Protect Journalists says 60 journalists have been killed between 1992 and 2018. Is silencing critics in Pakistan becoming the new normal? Dawn, the country's oldest and most respected daily newspaper, was blocked across most of the country last month after publishing an interview with Nawaz Sharif. Sharif has accused the army of supporting militants that had carried out a terrorist attack in Mumbai in 2008. In April, Pakistan's most popular television channel, Jio TV, was temporarily taken off the air over its criticism of the military. It was only allowed to resume broadcasts after agreeing to change its editorial stance in a way that met with approval from the authorities. But newspapers and TV channels are not the only ones subject to censorship. Under a cybercrime law passed in January, authorities have also begun a crackdown on social media.
And this is only the social space where people can have a difference of opinion. And then now if this kind of crackdown, of course they are going to send this signal to silence the voices, which are dissenting in this country.
And many prominent Pakistani columnists say they've had articles that cover anti-government protests by the Pashtun ethnic minority rejected by news outlets. So is Pakistan's army preventing journalists from publishing freely, all in the name of controlling state politics in Pakistan? Christine Piravolakis, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Karachi is Gibran Nasser. He's a human rights activist and running for office in the upcoming National Assembly elections. And in Islamabad, Matullah Jan. He's a journalist and host of a current affairs program. And in Islamabad is security analyst Tariq Pirzada. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Tariq Pirzada, let's start with you. Does the Pakistani army feel that there's a differentiation between participating in anti-state activities and voicing dissent?
There's too much of a propaganda warfare that is going on social media, and I strongly disagree with the premise. As a matter of fact, there are three major institutions in the country that are ensuring and guaranteeing freedom of expression and the holding of a third consecutive election in Pakistan. Number one, the judiciary of Pakistan. Number two, the Election Commission of Pakistan. And number three, the armed forces of Pakistan, who are standing behind the democratic process with all their security apparatus, making sure that nothing goes wrong on the day of the polling. And because the security can only be provided by the armed forces for the reason that the police system in our country is so flawed, the training is so bad, and the discipline is so pitiable that every single local election has to be done under the supervision of security troops and security forces. So the basic premise that somebody is trying to obstruct the freedom of expression in this country is so bizarre. Totally. Pakistan is so ideally situated in terms of freedom of expression that, for example, we have people participating in this program who speak against army every day on different Pakistani shows, and nobody says anything to them. So when it comes to the armed forces of Pakistan, they have made a fundamental decision that this freedom of expression and democratic process will have to be supported.
Mutullah, Tariq Pirzada said that the army was one of the institutions that upheld the democratic process. Yet last week, your picture was posted by the Pakistani military, and they labeled you as spreading anti-state propaganda. Are you trying to bring down the state?
Not at all. How dare I can do this? I think those who are trying to bring down the state are very much visible, and they are very much free to do it. Unfortunately, those who are part of the state are doing it, not the journalists. I was surprised to listen to this gentleman, Mr. Tariq Pirzada. I thought he is speaking from Washington. He's not living in Pakistan. I don't blame any institutions for the lack of press freedom.
I've been in many shows with you, Matullah Jan, and that's why I said you're the one who speak against the army, and nobody has put you in the jail.
Have some tolerance. So this is the state of tolerance and patience.
No, you're very much.
Even for those who represent, even for those who defend the army, you can look at the tolerance and patience of the gentleman who is defending
Pakistan.
Army, let alone the army and institutions.
No, I'm defending Pakistan.
Mr. Pirzada, let me speak. I heard you very patiently. You're not talking. Mr. Pirzada, let me hear. Have some patience.
Please go
have
ahead.
some decency to listen to the other point of view.
Please
Is this
go
the
ahead.
kind of freedom of expression you're defending? What kind of freedom of expression you're talking about when even a person like you cannot tolerate the opinions?
Well, look, it
Don't
is a part
interrupt,
of my
please.
democratic right
Let me complete my opinion.
A person
Listen to my
who is
opinion.
making false statements.
It is your democratic right, but let me have my democratic right first, Mr. Pirzada. Have some patience and do not spoil this discussion.
Gentlemen,
have
if we could actually just bring in Gibran,
All right,
this is
what
actually
I'm
a
trying to
voice
say is
who could actually give in some perspective here. Mutala, just a second here. Gibran Nasser, you're standing as a candidate in the upcoming elections. What do you make of all this? Is the Pakistani army trying to control the outcome of this election?
First of all, let us look at where the Pakistan army is an ordinary army. I don't think it's an ordinary army. I don't think it operates like most armies do. The Pakistani army runs a bank, it produces fertilizers, it manufactures cereals, it operates oil and other industry, it even operates a cellular network. It is very deeply involved in commercial activities, which armies around the world are not. Then again, the army is part of the executive. But we see the army stepping out of that and publicly condemning and rejecting notifications given by the executive, which means by its seniors, be it the cabinet or the prime minister. And furthermore, when we go about, the army is also choosing sides.
Garbage.
The army is also choosing sides.
This is an absolute garbage. Mr. Nasser, you are falsifying the facts on the ground.
I would respect the host. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the name. To please maintain some decorum. I believe if we are all here to present a positive image of Pakistan, that image would be best represented by us tolerating each other. Now, when you talk about the army being so deeply involved in public domain, in public dealings, then of course it invites public commentary. Now, when the army invites public commentary because it's so evolving, it's so ever-changing.
Hold on just 1 minute. Let's actually get our guests to actually get across their points.
Is the army behind the holding of this election or not?
Mr. Pirzada, we're going to come to you in a second. Mr. Nasser, if you could just continue.
Yes. So when army's role in the public domain, in the political domain is so evolving, is so ever-changing, it's very hard to draw the line. We often talk about the restrictions in our laws and in our constitution on what we can and cannot say about the armed forces. But because the army's role is so evolving and ever-changing, the lines become murky and blurry. And furthermore,
let me interrupt. I have to interrupt.
I'm failing to understand who's conducting this show.
The Article 62 says that you cannot.
I believe the host was conducting this show.
You will have your moment in just a second. Let's just have Mr. Nasser finish up his point, sir.
Against judiciary and against the armed forces of Pakistan. You cannot do mudslinging, but you can criticize them.
Mr. Pirzada, let me ask you then. Does the Pakistani army have a preference in the outcome of this election?
Okay, here is the answer.
To me?
If there was any ulterior motive, we would not be holding, or we would not have been entering into the third consecutive democratic election in the last 10 years. So that's number one. Number two, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces has said it very clearly dozens of times that Pakistan, the future of Pakistan lies with democracy. If they were not in favor of democracy, I think the kind of violations of constitutions that have been perpetrated by the politicians, these corrupt politicians like Nawaz Sharif, I think, you know what would have happened? The army would have taken it over long time ago, as it did in the past. So the proof that the army is staying away, that the proof a third election is happening, and the proof that people of Pakistan are enjoying total freedom of expression, as Mr. Gibran Nasser and Mr. Matiullah Jan are enjoying on your show, and in Pakistani press, they enjoy the same freedom because they speak against the army. They have spoken.
We are not enjoying freedom of expression. We are enjoying you.
That's exactly, Mr. Tariq Pirzada. I would like to bring in our other two guests. Let them speak, and we'll actually come back to you. Mutiullah Jan, what do you think the intentions were of the Pakistani army when they labeled you as such last week?
Yeah, I think the intentions were very much clear, and especially when these have not yet been clarified as well. It was a very simple thing to do, just to issue a clarification that the slides shown were not intended to show journalists in bad light or show them as anti-state elements, but no clarification was made.
Matiullah Jan,
So
you're not just a journalist.
Mr. Pirzada, you will get your time. Just please allow our guest to speak.
Mr. Pirzada, please let me have my freedom of expression, because people like you have a lot of faith in Pakistan. What I'm saying is that ahead of elections, these kind of pressures are being built on media to silence their voice, and to silence not only just
who
the
can silence your voice? You're too loud a person,
but also the media across the country. Mr. Pirzada, please, don't make noise, make some sensible arguments, please. What I'm saying is this,
I am giving you sensible argument.
Are very crucial.
Who has been able to silence you?
Before the elections, all
you
the
appeared with
institutions are
me
geared up
on
to
Raqqa
pressurize
television.
media.
You are appearing with me today in this show. You are speaking against the army, and nobody is stopping you.
Mr. Pirzada, nobody is speaking against army. When army has the friends like you, they don't need enemies.
You are. I have to say that.
So let
you
me,
are
they don't need
anti-army.
enemies.
I think you were expelled from the army also.
Mr.
And that is
Pirzada,
one
I am
of the
son of an army
reasons
officer.
that you speak against army.
I am son of an army officer. Who was your father?
I think somebody was expelled from army.
Gentlemen,
I am son of an army officer.
Let's not
I am son of
digress
an army officer.
from
Who was
the
your
discussion.
father? Was he in army? So I love army more than you, Mr. Pirzada, if that's what your standards are.
I think that's an incorrect statement.
So stop interfering now.
I've heard you myself.
At least have some respect now. What I'm saying is all these institutions, including the Supreme Court, and including the National Accountability Bureau, and including, of course, the military spokesman,
rather than discussing who loves the Pakistani army more, let's get back and concentrate on the discussion at hand. Jibran Nasser, when you look at Pakistan's, the army's role in politics, it's played for decades. Why doesn't it just come out and be more open with its intentions?
I think it already has come out and has been very open with its intention. We also need to realize that we're living in the comity of nation, where things on paper need to be a certain bit in order, whether they may not reflect that in reality. On paper, we are a modern democratic state, but in reality, we are moving more and more towards dictatorship. When you talk about enjoying freedom of expression means that you as a citizen can share your opinion, can voice your dissent within the ambit of the law without your credibility, your integrity, and your patriotism being questioned. When you have the highest office of the army spokesperson
it will be questioned
labeling
if your
journalists
motives are
or
ulterior.
anybody else being labeled, then it means that it is not a right. Freedom of expression is a privilege here, only given to those who are willing to voice a certain kind of opinion. Now, moving further, the result is what we have here today, what we are suffering from, is deeply militarized politics. And that's been facilitated by the democratic forces of Pakistan as well. Because whenever certain parties are in opposition,
Mr. Pirzada, I'm going to come to you, but please let's let Mr. Nasser finish up his point.
If I may take out a point, I may say one thing right now. This show, whenever it will air, it's very troubling for me, because Pakistan has, even whether it's a conservative side, it's a liberal side, it's a pro-state side, or somebody who are dissenting against state institutions, we have a variety of very civilized, tolerant commentators and analysts. This kind of a circus does disservice to my nation of 22 million people in front of an international audience, when the audience believes that Pakistanis cannot have a discussion amongst ourselves.
You represent some foreign element. Jibran Nasser, I know you. You don't represent this country at all.
Mr. Pirzada, let me ask my question to you then. When you look at the recent developments, one of the country's most prestigious or oldest English language newspapers, The Dawn, as well as the most prestigious television stations, why are they under so much pressure then? Mr. Pirzada?
All right, let me answer that question.
Pirzada, who is he?
Yes.
He creates a lot of noise today.
Yes. All right, Matiullah Jan, you are a fine journalist, but let me talk. Here is the answer. This newspaper, Dawn, has actually an establishment which is absolutely anti-Pakistan when it comes to protecting the national security interest of Pakistan.
So you say it's anti-Pakistan, but it was actually formed by the founder of your country. How can it be anti-Pakistan when it was formed by the founder of your country?
But he died. And this has
According
been transferred
to Mr.
into the head of
Jinnah was
those
also anti-Pakistan.
Anti-state.
According to Mr. Pirzada, Jinnah was also anti-Pakistan.
May I answer? Very briefly, I'll give you all the time. Dawn and Geo and Jung, When you appear on Indian television, as I do more frequently than any of the participants over here, I tell you one thing, they refer with a lot of confidence to two newspapers and televisions whom they believe they can trust. And both of them are Dawn and Geo, because both of these televisions represent the point of view of Mr. Modi and that of and a point of view of Washington, and the point of view that is anti-army, anti-judiciary, democratic setup in Pakistan.
Mr. Pirzada, I'm going to actually ask our two remaining guests to actually get their talk on it. Mr. Mutalajan, let me ask you. You look at Gul Bukhari, who was abducted by masked men. Another journalist, Asad Kural, who was physically assaulted and then hospitalized. And then what you've seen with you happened last week in the Pakistan military's presentation, being labeled as a supporter of anti-state activities prior to the elections. What effect do you think this will have on the electorate?
It will actually create an environment of fear and sense of insecurity, not only for media and journalists, and particularly for those whose pictures were shown on the slide, but also for the society as a whole.
And this is an incorrect statement.
For the politicians.
Media is so free. Journalists
For the politicians,
total freedom,
during this
and there is no restriction,
the
no
DGISPR
silencing
had
of voice.
also warned that they will tolerate anything against them, but not against the state. And I don't think DGISPR or military spokesman had this authority
no country
to give a
tolerates
warning.
anything against
it
the
is the
state.
federal
Mr.
government,
President,
it is the
show a
judiciary
little bit of
which has
respect
the right
to get
to take action.
our guests
He violated
commenting.
one law,
Please, sir.
and he was taken off
Please,
the
sir.
I think Mr. Pirzada sounds more like
in the United States.
I think Mr. Pirzada sounds more like a Sobedar major in army than an analyst, because he's just making noise and making no sense.
That shows your background.
So I think
that shows your respect for the armed
that is what I'm
forces.
saying. So that's
you
why
guys are
please do
living
not
for
interfere.
free because
Let me
the forces
complete.
are dying on the border.
Don't
Mr.
create
Pirzada,
noises.
forces are dying
He
on
has
the
asked me
border.
a question,
You
Mr.
guys
Pirzada.
tolerate
He has asked me a
forces
question.
because
Please,
forces are dying on the border.
give a
Please.
chance to our guests. Yes,
Mr.
Mr. Jan.
Pirzada, please. I'm requesting you, please show some patience, please. What I'm saying is that this is going to create a very vicious environment just before the election that will tarnish the credibility of the whole electoral process in Pakistan. This environment of insecurity and pressures on media, censorship, that is so blatant that TV channels are shut down in cantonment areas, newspaper distribution is blocked, journalists are being threatened and attacked and kidnapped. And as far as Gul Bukhari is concerned, the military spokesman has denied the involvement of the army in this, but this denial is no different from the denials in previous similar cases.
All right, Mr. Jan,
and there are so many Judicial Commission reports also, which have not been made public by any government.
I'm going to give the last say to Gibran Nasser. As a candidate in these upcoming elections, Mr. Jan talked about an atmosphere of fear, an atmosphere of insecurity. How is the country going to get over this and look forward to an election that's going to bring Pakistan forward?
When you talk about an election and a good election, we refer to a free and fair election. And for a free and fair election, you need accountability, transparency, and most importantly, free flow of information. When you are suppressing voices, when you are censoring voices, be it a newspaper or a channel or an article or a journalist, you are creating discrimination and you are, again, going towards a closed society, which is, again, I said, another indicator of militarized politics. We need free flow of information. You penalize defamation. You penalize sedition. When you suppress something, the benefit or the doubt given is that you're suppressing the truth, because that's what you're scared of, because that's what will bring the change. I believe that when we again and again say that army will ensure the election, when we again and again say that army will ensure security, when we again and again say that democracy stands because the army wants it so, we're already conceding it that the army has a say in it. Under the Constitution, the army is subservient to the executive branch, which is the current government, be it the interim government or the permanent government. The army should not supposed to have a say in it. It's supposed to follow orders which are supposed to be given. So with this very statement which Mr. Pirzada has been promoting over here, he's already conceding that the things that this whole country is being run as a puppet, and the puppeteer, that the strings are in the hands of someone else.
All right, Gibran Nasser, Mutalajan, and Tariq Pirzada, thank you very much for this heated debate. And we do have to remind our viewers that we had to cut Mr. Pirzada's microphone because he wasn't giving an opportunity for our other guests to talk. Thank you very much to all of you for this heated discussion.
we're telling the government that Kenyans come first. Forget China, forget everything else. We want our environment protected, and we want clean and healthy communities thriving in Lamu, Kitui, and all the other parts of the country.
Kenyans are up in arms over government plans to build a Chinese-funded coal power plant on the Lamu archipelago. The seaside town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's famed for its traditional coral stone houses and long sandy beaches. Kenyan officials insist the coal plant will help meet the country's growing energy demands. But critics say it'll destroy the area's natural beauty, not to mention its thriving tourism industry. Well, to discuss this, I'm now joined by Samia Omar Bawana. She is the coordinator of Decolonize, a campaign that promotes alternative energy in Kenya. Samia, good to have you here on the Newsmakers. So why are you opposed to this new proposed plant?
Well, it's outrageous for many reasons, but one of the key reasons that we're concerned about it as Kenyans as a whole is coal is not cheap. Coal is very expensive. And secondly, is that we have very many environmental impacts and social impacts that we expect with Lamu. Lamu is a very pristine environment. As you mentioned earlier, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has a biosphere reserve. We actually have the highest concentration of mangrove cover in the entire eastern coast of Africa. And there's a lot we have to lose. It's a big risk for us to have the coal power plant there, especially the biggest coal power plant in East Africa.
A lot to lose, but if you ask the government, there is a lot to gain. Kenyans are paying a lot for electricity, nearly double of what some other countries are paying in nearby regions. The government says it's going to reduce this cost. Isn't this a good plan?
Well, we're not against the government reducing costs, and I'm not against about having more power, but coal is not the only potential source of energy. Kenya is actually 8th in the world in producing geothermal energy. Just last year, we had a concern with a new wind project, 310 megawatt wind project, which actually hasn't been connected to the grid up to now. We're paying as taxpayers about 13.6 billion Kenya shillings per year for penalties for not putting it in the grid. We also have new wind farms, investors that have come in the last year and have been turned away from Kenya from investing in renewable energy. So we have a lot of sunlight, more sunlight than Germany.
Why were they turned around?
Well, maybe nobody's getting a cut. I wouldn't know the reason, but that's exactly the questions we're asking. Why turn away renewable energy projects that will maintain and sustain a green economy, and then put up a coal power plant in one of the most pristine areas in Africa, not only in Kenya?
Ali Wario, he's a member of parliament. He's also a member of the Environmental Committee. He said that they've promised that as a parliamentary committee, they're going to look into the issue and they're going to take the necessary actions. Do you believe him?
Well, I'd like to believe him, but a few of us have read the environmental impact assessment. The Kenyan laws are put there to safeguard us. There's already been an ESIA on the project that has so many gaps, and yet it was passed by the National Environmental Management Authority, which we put trust in to vet these projects. So we're more willing to listen to it if actions speak louder than words. So we would like the project to be stopped. Instead, they are fast-tracking it. So if parliamentarians are really concerned about it, then this issue should be raised in Parliament and not necessarily in news media or outlets like that.
How is this proposed coal plant going to affect this UNESCO World Heritage Site? How could it affect it?
Well, it's very close. It's less than 20 kilometers close to the UNESCO World Heritage Site. Currently, a majority, almost 85% of the population in Lamu are reliant on natural resources. And the coal power plant will directly have an impact on the natural resources. And earlier you mentioned about the UNESCO site relying on coral stone. That's because our architecture relies on mangrove. We actually have a unique setting where we're licensed to use mangrove, unlike other of our counterparts in other parts of Kenya, because our architecture cannot work without mangrove. So you have these projects that's directly threatening it, the mangrove harvesting, as well as fisheries. 75% of our economy is dependent on fisheries, which sustains the tourism industry. Tourists come, for the beaches. They come for for the cuisine, and that is what allows some of the locals to have a revenue to be able to maintain these old buildings. It's very expensive to maintain them, and it's tourism that thrives in Lamu that allows them to maintain it.
So you're sitting across the government and they ask you to present me a plan on how to generate more energy to meet my citizens' demands and to create jobs.
See, that's the thing. That's what do you call it, misinformation in the media. Currently, we have 2,200 megawatts of power. We're using only 1,900 of it, which is okay. We need some extra in case there's an outage. According to Power Africa, which has done research on it, within 5 years, we will have 2,700 more megawatts partly from renewables, but not including coal. We already are expecting to have 2,700 megawatts. And our needs are 5,040 megawatts of power. So in total, when you look at current power needs and future power growth, we actually have enough. And it's just an exaggeration, I think, by the government to say without coal, we cannot achieve energy, especially if we're turning away investors like the Swedish company that came in just a few months ago. A 600 megawatt wind farm would have been the biggest in East Africa, actually the biggest in Africa, and they've now moved to Tanzania to put up the project there, citing frustrations from the government. So that's one of the reasons we don't think the government is genuine about investing green energy, despite the fact that Vision 2030 blueprint of Kenya has put green economy or sustainable green economy as one of its key pillars. Not an economy, a sustainable green economy, which cannot be achieved when you're producing a 980 megawatt coal power plant.
Samia Omar Bawana, thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmaker and shedding some more light on this fascinating subject. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Ali Janayanar. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, join us on a one-hour special on the U.S.-North Korea summit as two of the world's most controversial leaders, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, engage in an historic meeting. Until then, thanks for watching and goodbye.